The artillery barrage began right at midday. It was Thursday, March 30th, 1972, Holy Thursday in the Christian calendar. In an instant, the northernmost outposts of the Republic of Vietnam became the front line of the largest conventional invasion the Vietnam War had ever seen. Along the demilitarized zone, splitting the country in two, hundreds of guns opened fire almost at the exact same moment. Fire bases that sat quiet all winter long shook from the concussion. American advisors scrambled for their radios. South Vietnamese officers grabbed their maps. And somewhere inside that heavy smoke, a soldier from the newly formed 3rd Infantry Division stood in his fighting position. It took him about 3 minutes to understand the brutal truth. The war he thought he knew was over. What was about to begin was something else entirely. Over the next 33 days, the province of Quang Tri would fall. Within 140 days, one of the most sustained urban battles of the entire conflict would consume the ancient Citadel right at its center. 81 days and nights of close combat would leave behind a city that observers would eventually compare to Berlin in 1945. By the time that smoke finally cleared, the political future of Southeast Asia would already be written into the dirt of a single Vietnamese province. The terms of the Paris Peace Accords, the shape of the American exit, and the countdown to the fall of Saigon all decided right there.
Here on ARVN and United States Military, we do not just read history, we live it. These are the exact battles that shaped one of the most complex and defining conflicts of the 20th century. If you are new here, go ahead and subscribe now, because this is one fight you definitely do not want to miss. Make sure to stay with us until the end, because what happened on September 16th reveals something about war and memory that no textbook ever quite explains. That was the day the flag went up over the west gate of the Citadel, and in the pre-dawn hours of that very same morning, the last defenders inside those walls made an orderly withdrawal north, straight across the Thach Han River. It showed exactly how two national stories grew from the exact same soil. Drop a comment down below. What do you think ultimately decided this battle? Was it the strategy of the generals, the raw courage of the men and women who fought it, or the massive political forces that neither side could fully control? We really want to hear how you see it. But to truly understand the storm that broke on March 30th, we have to start not with the guns, but with the politics. And the politics begins right in Washington. By early 1972, American troop strength in South Vietnam had completely collapsed. The numbers peaked in 1969 at roughly 543,000 personnel.
By January of 1972, that dropped to about 140,000. By April, it would fall below 70,000. And when the offensive finally began, only about 65,000 American service members remained on Vietnamese soil, mostly in support and advisory roles. For the United States, the ground war was effectively over. What remained was air power, naval power, and a lingering promise that South Vietnamese forces could carry the fight entirely by themselves. That promise had a specific name. President Richard Nixon called it Vietnamization. The entire idea was to build the South Vietnamese armed forces into something capable of defending their own territory. American aid would replace American soldiers. American aircraft would step in for American infantry. And once that transition was fully complete, the United States could withdraw with honor. They would leave behind an ally that could finally stand on its own 2 feet. By early 1972, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam had grown to about 742,000 personnel. That meant 350,000 regular main force troops and roughly 400,000 territorial and local defense forces. Numerically speaking, it was already one of the largest armies in the world. The only question was whether numbers alone would be enough. Over in Hanoi, the leadership of the Workers' Party of Vietnam spent the previous 18 months studying that exact question. The internal debate had been fierce.
Some argued the shifting military balance still favored patience, a slow war of gradual attrition dragged out until the very last American soldier left. Others saw things differently. They believed the strategic window was narrowing, not widening. American aid to Saigon might actually grow instead of shrinking once those ground troops were fully gone. If they were ever going to strike a decisive blow, it had to happen while American forces were still packing up, not after they had already left the country. Finally, they reached a conclusion. The United States was definitely leaving. President Nixon was completely preoccupied with the upcoming November presidential election, and while Vietnamization looked capable on paper, it had never been tested against a full-scale conventional attack. If they struck right now and struck hard, they could accomplish several strategic goals all at once. They could shatter those South Vietnamese main force units before Vietnamization fully matured. It was a chance to expose just how dependent those troops were on American firepower. Taking valuable territory would also strengthen their hand at the peace negotiations already underway in Paris. And if everything went right, the offensive might even bring down President Nguyen Hue in Saigon. The plan that finally emerged from those months of heavy deliberation was named the Nguyen Hue Campaign. It was named after the 18th century Vietnamese emperor who defeated a Chinese invasion at Dong Da. Western observers would later call it the Easter Offensive, simply because it began on Holy Thursday. But for Vietnamese soldiers and their families in the years that followed, it would be known as the Spring-Summer Campaign of 1972. The campaign called for 3 simultaneous strategic thrusts. In the Central Highlands, North Vietnamese army forces would push toward Kon Tum and Pleiku, aiming to slice the country right in two. Down south, other North Vietnamese divisions would move north from Cambodia toward the town of An Loc, just 60 miles outside Saigon. And up north, right along the demilitarized zone, the main axis of attack would fall heavily on the province of Quang Tri. Quang Tri province stretched from the mountains of Laos all the way to the South China Sea. It was cut by rivers and low hills, making every single mile highly defensible. By South Vietnamese standards, it was pretty thinly populated, but it held Vietnam's oldest north-south road, Highway 1, the vital artery that connected kings and armies for 1,000 years. Whoever held Quang Tri basically held the door to the north, and losing it meant opening the way directly to Hue, the ancient imperial capital, just 40 miles further south. North Vietnamese planners committed 3 infantry divisions to the Tri Tien front for the initial wave. These were the 304th, the 308th, and the 324th B. They brought over 100 tanks, 4 artillery regiments, 3 armored regiments, along with specialized rocket and support units. Around 45,000 troops marched south in that very first wave, and before the campaign finally ended, more than 100,000 soldiers from the People's Army of Vietnam would rotate through that exact front. 2 new weapon systems appeared in significant numbers for the first time in the war. First was the Strela II, a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile that could threaten low-flying aircraft right from concealment. Then came the AT-3 Sager. This wire-guided anti-tank missile could reach out 3,000 meters, punching through the heaviest armor in South Vietnam's inventory. Hanoi had spent years preparing for this exact fight. To fill those ranks, the North reached into places its army rarely touched before. Starting in the spring of 1972, an estimated 10,000 university students and young lecturers were rapidly mobilized from about 30 different colleges across Hanoi. Many of them were barely in their late teens. A lot were born in 1953 or 1954. They simply put down their books, put on their uniforms, and boarded trucks bound for the South. For many families in the North that spring, the mobilization order arrived as a summons and the final farewell in the exact same envelope. Sons studying literature, medicine, or engineering were suddenly transformed into infantry riflemen. Some parents managed to put on a brave face. Others simply could not.
the trucks left the university gates and rolled south down Highway 1. Very few of those young men and women would ever come back. At the memorial cemetery at Trong Son and along the walls of the Quang Tri Citadel Memorial, long rows of headstones bear those exact birth years, and the death dates carved beside them fall only weeks or months after the soldiers reach the front. The actual timing of the offensive was a message all on its own. It was deliberately scheduled between two of the most important diplomatic trips of the Nixon presidency, his opening to Beijing in February and his crucial summit with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev in Moscow that May. As the French newspaper Le Figaro later pointed out, Hanoi picked those dates on purpose. They were not about to let the great powers negotiate over the head of Vietnam. American and South Vietnamese intelligence saw almost none of this coming. Pre-offensive assessments largely concluded that North Vietnamese forces in the South were stuck in a strategically passive posture. Intelligence suggested they suffered from serious supply shortages and tanking troop morale. Experts figured any military activity in 1972 would be limited to the same low levels seen at the end of 1971. Sure, some minor bumps in activity were expected around the American election in November, but nothing on the massive scale of a full conventional invasion was seriously anticipated. American intelligence reportedly guessed the North might eventually threaten Hue, but could not take Da Nang further south. Even that cautious warning proved way too limited for the absolute storm that was about to unfold.
They were dead wrong on every single count. Up on the northern frontier, before March 30th, the newly formed South Vietnamese 3rd Infantry Division was caught in a terrible tactical spot. Regiments were mid-rotation. Communications were totally fragmented. Their commander, Brigadier General Vu Van Jai, born in Nhan Dan in 1934, took charge just 5 months prior. He was a 20-year infantry veteran, and American advisors called him a capable soldier handed a nearly impossible task. His division was raw. Regiments had never trained as a unified force, yet they held the most exposed sector of the border, right in the path of the largest conventional attack the war had ever seen. They had to hold a stretch of border over 60 kilometers wide. It ran straight from the coastal plains deep into the rugged foothills where Route 9 crossed into Laos. The province he had to defend was at his back. Ahead of him, a growing shadow, something he could feel but couldn't completely see. The winter from 1971 into 72 had been strangely quiet along the demilitarized zone. Almost no major ground fights. American reconnaissance was looking the other way. So when intelligence picked up North Vietnamese armor and heavy artillery moving around, they just assumed it was reinforcing positions inside Laos, not prepping a massive border assault. Based on history, that was a pretty reasonable guess. It was also catastrophically wrong. By March 29th, heavy monsoon clouds blanketed the demilitarized zone. American spy planes were grounded.
Under that dark cover, tens of thousands of North Vietnamese troops slipped into their final assault positions. Artillery was already dialed into South Vietnamese outposts they had scouted for months. Tanks hid in the tree lines, engines cold. Just south of the border, farmers went to sleep exactly like they always did, totally unaware their world was about to end. Midday on March 30th, 1972, those guns finally fired. The Battle of Quang Tri had started. We are talking hundreds of heavy guns, hidden in tree lines and ridges just north of the border. They had been sitting there for weeks, dialed into targets their crews had memorized. Behind that artillery waited an initial wave of 45,000 North Vietnamese soldiers, infantry ready to push, tank crews waiting in cold turrets, combat engineers prepped to bridge any gap. Pulling the strings was a command apparatus that had been quietly building for this exact moment since the invasion plan was approved back in October. The ground they were about to hit held a deep, heavy history. Quang Tri province stretched roughly 50 miles north to south and about 40 miles inland. Up north, the Ben Hai River marked the demilitarized zone. Back in 1954, It was drawn up as a temporary buffer. Instead, it became one of the most heavily armed borders on the planet. South of the river, the landscape opened into a coastal plain along the South China Sea.
Two major rivers sliced right through it, the Qua Viet, dumping into a port of the same name, and the Tak Han, flowing south right past the ancient walls of Quang Tri city. Pushing inland, those plains turned into low hills, eventually climbing into rugged mountains against the Laotian border. Highway 1 served as the coastal artery running north to south. Route 9 cut east to west from the port of Qua Viet, through Quang Tri city, past the abandoned American base at Khe Sanh, and right into Laos. Along those western hills, South Vietnamese fire bases like Camp Carroll, Fire Base Fuller, Fire Base Sarge, and Fire Base Khe Jo guarded the door from Laos. North of Route 9, a scatter of smaller fire bases, known only by simple letter and number codes, watched the demilitarized zone itself. At the heart of that western line sat Camp Carroll, the absolute linchpin of the northern defense. Resting on a broad plateau west of Cam Lo, it dominated the surrounding hills. Its guns, including heavy, long-range 175mm self-propelled howitzers, could strike anywhere inside the demilitarized zone. This was the largest single concentration of South Vietnamese artillery in Military Region 1. Losing it would tear a massive, unfillable hole right through the western flank. The fire support base system was an American idea, adapted by the South Vietnamese Army over years of joint combat. Each base held an infantry company, a couple artillery batteries, and support elements. They stayed linked by foot patrols and supply roads. It was a solid setup for fighting a lightly armed insurgency. But it was never meant to survive a massive conventional assault driven by heavy tanks and long-range artillery. Sadly, that was exactly what they were about to face. Whoever controlled this dirt held the front door to northern South Vietnam. Both sides fortified it, and that is exactly why Hanoi chose to strike here. General Vo Nguyen Giap held the ultimate strategic authority. He engineered the 1954 victory over the French at Dien Bien Phu and now served as defense minister. The detailed planning fell to Van Tien Dung, chief of the general staff. Both men were absolute legends in Vietnamese military history, but neither of them would actually command in the field directly. Field command for the Northern Axis, the Tri Tien Front, went to Lieutenant General Le Trong Tan. Born in October 1914 in a village that is now part of Hanoi, he joined the Viet Minh in 1943, changing his given name from Le Trong To to Le Trong Tan. He would eventually reach the absolute highest rank in the People's Army and serve as chief of the general staff into the 1980s. But in the spring of 1972, he was leading the charge that kicked off the Easter Offensive, working with his political commissar, Le Quang Dao, to shape the campaign's ideological drive. Their initial strike force leaned heavily on 3 infantry divisions. The 304th was one of the Army's oldest bleeding at Dien Bien Phu. The 308th held a similar legacy from brutal combat in the Northwest. Then there was the newer 324th B. They would push south from Laos, attack along Route 9, and completely outflank those western fire bases from the exact direction the South Vietnamese least expected. Attached to those divisions was the B-5 Front Headquarters, bringing a staggering amount of backup. For supporting regiments, 1 Rocket Artillery Regiment. For field artillery regiments, 3 Armored Regiments, 2 Independent Local Force Regiments. This arsenal proved they had been preparing for years. Well over 100 tanks waited in staging areas, primarily heavy T-54 main battle tanks, backed by T-76 amphibious units, and a few older T-34s. Their long-range 130mm field guns could hurl 70-pound shells 17 miles, completely outranging every single South Vietnamese howitzer in the province. Plus, for the first time,
new Soviet hardware was hitting the battlefield. They brought the Strela II shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile to ambush low-flying planes, and the AT-3 Sagar wire-guided anti-tank missile, which could melt armored vehicles from 3,000 meters away. Standing right across the border was the 3rd Infantry Division of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Barely 5 months old, they were formally activated in October of 1971. Their core regiments, the 2nd, the 56th, and the 57th, were basically pieced together from territorial and regional forces.
They held brand new gear. Their officers were still figuring out how to lead together. And by early 1972, that glaring inexperience had Saigon openly worried. The 3rd Division did have some heavy backup attached to them. Out front were the 147th and 258th Marine Brigades. The 1st Armor Brigade supplied the muscle, rolling in with the 20th Tank Squadron boasting 57 M48 main battle tanks and a bunch of M41 light tanks. Several Ranger groups screened the western edge. Backing everything up, territorial and popular forces stood guard across the local civilian settlements. Commanding Military Region 1, South Vietnam's northernmost sector, holding Quang Tri, was Lieutenant General Hoang Xuan Lam. He had led the 1st Corps for years. He was a capable administrator, highly connected in Saigon politics, but quietly, American observers and his own officers deeply criticized him. To them, he was just too cautious a leader who always hesitated to make the really hard calls under pressure. Under Lam, out on the 3rd Division front, you had Brigadier General Zhai, a man who took command just 5 months prior. Beneath him, holding Camp Carroll, was Lieutenant Colonel Pham Van Dinh of the 56th Regiment. And below Dinh, scattered across the fire bases and border outposts, were the battalion commanders, the company captains, the platoon leaders. These were the men forced to translate grand national strategy into blood and dirt decisions under fire. Beside them stood a small, heavy-hitting group of American advisors, the final remnants of the roughly 65,000 United States personnel still in the country. Colonel Joshua W. Dorsey III acted as senior Marine advisor to Lieutenant General Le Nguyen Cang, the Commandant of the Vietnamese Marine Corps. Lieutenant Colonel Gerald H. Turley guided operations for the Vietnamese Marine Division. Major James R. Joy and Major Robert F. Sheridan advised the individual brigades. Then there was the 3rd Marine Battalion of the Vietnamese Marines, and attached to them was a young captain named John W. Ripley. Within days, his name would burn itself into the history of the United States Marine Corps in a way absolutely no one saw coming. High overhead, the remaining American air power sat ready. Over in Thailand, at U Tapao Royal Thai Air Force Base, B-52 Stratofortress bombers idled on the ramp. Farther out on Guam, at Andersen Air Force Base, even more waited. Off the coast, aircraft carriers of the United States 7th Fleet prowled the South China Sea. Naval gunfire, tactical air support, and eventually heavy strategic bombing had to fill the massive gap left by American ground troops. Men who were no longer there and who, in most cases, were never coming back. On paper, both sides had plans that made perfect sense. Hanoi wanted a heavy artillery barrage to crush the border fire bases, followed by armored columns driving south down the coast and southeast out of Laos. These two spearheads were supposed to meet at the town of Dong Ha, cross the Qua Viet River, and seize Quang Tri City. At the exact same time, other units would punch toward the port of Qua Viet to choke off naval resupply. Once they locked down the province, the entire offensive would pivot south toward Hue, the old imperial capital, and the beating psychological heart of northern South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese strategy leaned on the 3rd Division, along with attached Marine and Ranger units, to hold those border fire bases just long enough for Southern reserves to show up. From there,
They would anchor a coordinated defense along the natural river barriers. Heavy artillery was supposed to make up for their lack of manpower. Airstrikes, especially American planes, would handle whatever the big guns could not destroy. Finally, mobile reserves would plug any holes in the line. Neither blueprint survived the first 24 hours of actual combat. Both looked perfectly reasonable in a briefing room, but out in the mud, things changed. The exact timing of the assault, the brutal weather, the sheer inexperience of the newly formed 3rd Division, it all unraveled. Add in bone-tired soldiers who had been sitting in the trenches far too long, plus a massive mutual underestimation of the enemy, and it created a nightmare neither commander saw coming. And there was one final variable no strategist could plot on a map.
Out on a border that had stayed quiet for months, the men on both sides had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Morning patrols, light interdiction, occasional harassment fire. It was the slow, dragging tempo of a war that everyone figured would end in a conference room, not a trench. But that quiet rhythm was about to shatter into a million pieces. For the men staring across that line, the days before March 30th carried a heavy, suffocating tension. Rumors had been swirling for weeks. Something big was coming. Every veteran in the dirt could feel it, but nobody knew exactly what or when it would hit. A few units doubled up on patrols. Others reinforced their bunkers. Some just waited. Down in the villages along Highway 1, people had lived with fighting so long that the warning signs felt like shifting seasons. Elders quietly packed valuables and headed inland. The younger folks tried to hold on to normal life, working markets, tending fields, raising children who had never seen a single day of peace. Right at midday on March 30th, in the agonizing seconds before the first round dropped, all of it, the artillery, the armor, the scared kids, the generals, the grand assumptions held perfectly still in one fragile, breathless equilibrium. Then the shell fell. The balance shattered. The hours ahead would test every single one of them. 3 minutes in, they knew exactly what kind of war this was.
All along the demilitarized zone, from the steep mountain outposts near the Laotian border, all the way to coastal fire bases overlooking the South China Sea, the barrage hit almost everywhere at once. Firebase Sarge went dead silent in a matter of minutes. Firebase Nui Ba Ho was completely severed from contact before its commander could even organize a response. Firebase Fuller absorbed brutal, sustained hits. Over at Firebase Keijo, isolated on a ridge west of Cam Lo, tanks were already swarming them before the incoming artillery had even stopped falling. Frantic radio operators twisted dials, begging higher headquarters for help. At several bases, nobody answered back. Within just a few hours, the entire outer ring of fire bases north of Route 9 outposts, known by codes like A2, C1, and C2, called in that they were being overrun. Their infantry fell back on foot toward the flat coastal plain, leaving their massive artillery guns either spiked or captured in the dirt. Up along those western hills, the newly minted South Vietnamese 3rd Infantry Division realized a terrifying truth. This was not a standard skirmish. They were being hammered by a deeply synchronized conventional army, one that had stalked their lines for months and knew exactly where to twist the knife. Back at division headquarters, Brigadier General Jai desperately cycled through his options. The radio link to 1st Corps down in Da Nang kept dropping out. His regiments were calling in wildly conflicting reports from across the map.
Some units held the line. Others were just vanishing. Worse, the thick monsoon clouds that had hidden the enemy buildup were now blocking out the American airstrikes he so desperately needed. When the sun set on day 1, the sheer scale of the disaster was obvious. By the end of day 2, it was spinning completely out of control. On April 2nd, 1972,
Easter Sunday on the calendar, the invasion triggered two of the most critical events of its early phase, and they struck at almost the exact same time. The first domino fell at Camp Carroll. That plateau firebase west of Cam Lo held the largest single cluster of South Vietnamese artillery in the entire military region. Lieutenant Colonel Pham Van Dinh of the 56th Regiment was in charge. By the morning of April 2nd, his camp was totally boxed in. The men were taking brutal, sustained fire from heavy North Vietnamese guns. The infantry was hopelessly outnumbered. Ammo was scraping the bottom. Radio contact with command was practically dead. And the other supporting units across the line were way too busy surviving to offer any help. Dinh pulled his officers together. Then, he made a choice that would haunt the rest of the war. He surrendered the base. Roughly 1,500 troops of the 56th Regiment marched off as prisoners. 22 vital artillery pieces, including the massive long-range 175mm self-propelled howitzers anchoring the Western defense, were handed over completely intact.
No one blew the ammo dumps. No one spiked the gear. Later that afternoon, on the eastern edge of the fighting, South Vietnamese forces also walked away from My Loc, the very last Western firebase on the map. Handing over Camp Carroll completely flipped the operational math of the Western defensive line in a matter of hours. Neighboring firebases, already drowning in incoming fire, suddenly realized those captured South Vietnamese big guns would soon be pointed right at their bunkers. The infantrymen who defended Carroll were now marching north as captives, and that pristine, long-range artillery, designed to blast targets inside the demilitarized zone, was now physically swiveling around to face south. Down in Saigon, the news hit like a physical blow. The absolute largest artillery hub in Military Region 1 handed over without a bitter fight. Up in Hanoi, the reaction was pure, cold satisfaction. In the eyes of the Politburo, the policy of Vietnamization had just spectacularly failed its very first test. Out in the farming villages across northern Quang Tri, the psychological terror was instant. A deep panic that would slowly bleed south down Highway 1 over the coming days. But roughly 130 kilometers eastward, at practically the exact same hour on that very same day, a totally different kind of story was playing out at the bridge in Dong Ha. The Dong Ha Bridge funneled Highway 1 directly over the Qua Viet River. If North Vietnamese tanks managed to cross it, absolutely nothing between that river and Quang Tri City could stop them. Captain John W. Ripley, a Marine born on June 29, 1939, out of Radford, Virginia, now advising the 3rd Vietnamese Marine Battalion, grasped the stakes instantly. So did the handful of officers standing by him, including United States Army Major James E. Smock, who could feed him demolition supplies from above. Ripley was 32 years old. He had been sweating it out as an advisor for months, and the second he realized exactly what had to be done to that bridge, he did not stand around waiting for permission. Ripley climbed under the bridge. He pulled himself hand over hand along the steel beams. The river flowed far beneath him. North Vietnamese armor and infantry were closing in from the north. Enemy fire hit everywhere. Hanging there, he planted about 500 pounds of explosives on the main structural supports. He made 5 different trips, all under fire. For nearly 3 hours, he dangled in the open air. The charges blew, and the bridge crashed into the Qua Viet River. That North Vietnamese armored column completely lost its crossing route. Now, this single action did not win the wider battle. Quang Tri province was doomed to fall within the month anyway, but it bought them time. Soldiers who would have died on that road south of Dong Ha got another few hours, days, or even decades of life. A single act of human courage carved its way into a war usually measured by body counts. Ripley earned the Navy Cross for what he did at Dong Ha. In 2026,
Decades later, and 18 years after he died in 2008, that cross was finally upgraded to the Medal of Honor. But back on April 2nd, 1972, the front lines were pure chaos. Only his advisors, his Vietnamese counterparts, and a few Americans saw what he pulled off. Everyone else would find out much later, slowly, over the years. For 3 weeks after Camp Caro and the Dong Ha Bridge, the North Vietnamese advance stalled. It did not end. They just moved units, resupplied, and locked in artillery coordinates. During this break, South Vietnamese defenders actually won some real, hard-fought victories. From April 9th to the 11th, they crushed attacks on Firebase Pedro. On April 18th, they threw back the 308th Division advancing from the southwest. Marines, Rangers, and whatever was left of the 3rd Division figured something out. With good air support and solid lines, they could actually hold their ground. But that pause was never a real victory. It was just an intermission. And when the second act started, the middle defensive line completely shattered. On April 27th, the 308th Division launched its final strike on Dong Ha, a town fought over for weeks. By April 28th, the North Vietnamese took it completely. Then came a move that doomed the whole campaign.
The 20th Tank Squadron abandoned its blocking position with 0 orders from headquarters to do so. Pure panic bled down the highway behind them. Over the next 2 days, the middle line at I-2, just north of Quang Tri City, folded entirely. On April 30th, Brigadier General Gi ordered a general retreat. He told his men to pull back to the Thach Han and Mai Chan rivers to build a fresh defensive line. Hours later, Lieutenant General Lam at 1st Corps headquarters canceled that order. He demanded all units hold fast, no matter the cost. Saigon was pushing him hard. The Paris peace talks were starting back up soon. If they fell back voluntarily right now, the whole world would view it as a total South Vietnamese defeat. For Brigadier General Gi, hearing that reversal from 1st Corps on the last night of April must have felt like a trap springing shut. He spent 5 months building a division from pieces that never trained together. He tried defending a massive border with barely any men. And now, just when a clean retreat could have saved the core of his command, he was ordered to stand firm on ground that was already totally lost. That reversed order didn't create a defense. It caused absolute chaos. Some units were already running. Others tried to fight. Radios went silent between commands. On May 1st, 1972, Marine Brigade 147, the final organized group left on the line, pulled out at 2:30 in the afternoon. Brigadier General Gi and his staff fled by helicopter just before 5. Minutes after they lifted off, North Vietnamese soldiers breached the Citadel of Quang Tri. By May 2nd, the final fire base in the region fell. The entire Quang Tri province now belonged completely to the North Vietnamese. But the horror of those final days was not just for the soldiers. Just south of Quang Tri City, on Highway 1 near Hai Lang, tens of thousands of civilians merged with the retreating military. They walked or rode south toward Hue. The convoys were massive, some stretched for 3 miles. It was a chaotic mix, mostly civilian families, but the trucks were almost all military, and they were completely out in the open. North Vietnamese artillery waited on both sides of the road, and they opened fire. That bloody stretch of pavement is remembered today in Vietnam as Dai Lo Kinh Hoang, the Highway of Horror. Death tolls varied wildly. The Red Cross estimated around 2,000 killed. South Vietnamese reporters who walked the site themselves counted much higher, some claiming up to 5,000. The dead were retreating soldiers, hospital patients trying to escape Quang Tri City, and ordinary families clutching whatever they could carry on their backs. Later that summer, when forces reclaimed the area, a South Vietnamese photojournalist named Nhan Dan set up volunteer recovery teams along that road. He published a series called collecting the bodies of the people of Quang Tri. To this day, it stands as one of the most chilling accounts ever produced by Vietnamese reporters during the war. The things his camera captured were far too grim for any standard newspaper page. Across political divides in Vietnam today, the highway of horror is mourned purely as a civilian tragedy. Those victims still rest in cemeteries and hidden graves right next to the road they hoped would save them. There is no real monument on the highway to honor what happened. The road simply carries traffic just like it has for 1,000 years. By May 6, 1972, the South Vietnamese 3rd Infantry Division, the same men ordered to hold the border back on March 30th, could only find 2,700 soldiers. They started the campaign with over 10,000. Everyone else was dead, wounded, captured, or wandering lost across the fallen province. Along the Mai Chan River, about 15 miles north of Hue, those exhausted survivors grabbed shovels and dug in. Behind them was a ruined province. Ahead of them in the coming days lay a storm none of them could predict. But someone was flying north from Saigon to take over. His name was Nguyen Quang Trong, and the broken army he inherited wasn't done fighting yet.
He stepped into 1st Corps headquarters on May 3, 1972. That was 3 days after Quang Tri City fell, 1 day after the province lost its last firebase, and exactly 41 days after the very first artillery shells hit the demilitarized zone. Nguyen Quang Trong was just 42 years old. Born on December 19, 1929, down in the Mekong Delta region of Nguyen Hue Province, he earned his infantry commission in 1954. During the 1968 Tet Offensive, he commanded the South Vietnamese 1st Infantry Division, defending the imperial city of Hue. That brutal 6-week urban street fight left the ancient walls completely in ruins, but kept the city safe in South Vietnamese hands. Now, in 1972, he had been a lieutenant general for less than a year. Yet, among the Americans who actually fought beside him, he was widely regarded as the absolute finest field commander in the entire South Vietnamese military. His new mission was incredibly simple to say and almost impossible to pull off. Stop the North Vietnamese dead in their tracks. Save Hue. Take back whatever ground he could, and do it all with an army that was closer to total collapse than at any other point in the war. Trong moved fast. He wore reading glasses and spoke softly. The Americans rarely ever heard him raise his voice, but when he gave an order, his men moved without a second thought. Within days, he pushed his command post right into the Citadel of Hue.
It was a loud signal to everyone watching. Hue would not be abandoned. He quickly pulled in elite formations from other military regions: the Vietnamese Marine Division, the Airborne Division, and the 1st Infantry Division. 3 of the absolute best fighting forces they had, all merged under his direct command. They built a hard defensive line along the My Chan River, just north of Hue. Reinforcements fortified the trenches, ammo arrived, and then the monsoon weather finally cleared. That open sky changed everything, especially the war overhead. All through April, thick monsoon clouds blocked American planes from scouting or flying strike missions. But in May, those clouds broke. B-52 bombers flying out of U Tapao in Thailand and Andersen Air Force Base on Guam started hammering North Vietnamese supply lines and staging camps. Tactical jets off the United States 7th Fleet carriers joined the fight. Between May and June, over 18,000 sorties backed up the South Vietnamese troops across all 3 fronts. The B-52 bombers alone flew another 2,724 missions during that exact same stretch. Right on the My Chan line, a massive South Vietnamese counterpunch slowly took shape. And on June 28, 1972, they launched it. Operation Lam Son 72,
Named for a site where 15th century Vietnamese fighters defeated Chinese invaders, kicked off with a midnight crossing of the My Chan River. Marine and airborne troops pushed north.
They moved through terrain that just weeks prior served as the final defensive line for a retreating army. Trong actually wanted to bypass Quang Tri city entirely, preferring to hit North Vietnamese forces out in the open. But President Thieu, down in Saigon, vetoed the idea. The city had to be taken head-on. The ongoing peace talks in Paris carried heavy political weight, way more than any operational preference. Taking it back wouldn't come easy. Inside Quang Tri, North Vietnamese defenders had made good use of the 6 weeks since May 2nd. Led by Lieutenant General Tran Van Quang, who brought in long-range 130mm field guns, they heavily fortified the ancient citadel. It was a massive square, nearly 500 meters across, boasting walls 15 feet high and 30 inches thick, originally built in 1824 under the Nguyen dynasty of Emperor Minh Mang. Tunnels crisscrossed beneath the grounds. Interlocking kill zones were fully set. Plus, Soviet-supplied 130mm guns sitting north of the Thach Han River could strike 17 miles into any staging area. By July 10th, the Airborne Division launched the assault. 3 understrength battalions from the 2nd Airborne Brigade, the 5th, the 6th, and the 11th pushed right up against the Citadel walls. Taking the brunt of the offensive was the 5th Airborne Battalion. In just 2 weeks, they lost 98 men killed and 400 wounded out of roughly 600. Commanders bluntly told their American advisors they just didn't have the manpower left to keep attacking. New recruits were trickling in, sure, but most had barely any training. July 23rd brought a breakthrough when a laser-guided bomb blasted open the northeast rampart of the Citadel. Paratroopers poured through the gap. Then, a devastating friendly airstrike accidentally hit that exact spot. 45 paratroopers died. 100 more were wounded. The breach completely collapsed. When those paratroopers finally came off the line in early August, one American advisor remarked they looked like they'd aged 10 years in 3 weeks. 4 of the 6 American advisors working with the 2nd Airborne Brigade were actually wounded and hospitalized during the brutal fighting. The brigade's replacement pool was totally dry. What was left of the unit simply couldn't mount another offensive. On July 27th, the Vietnamese Marine Division stepped into the main offensive role. Alongside the airborne, these Marines served as one of the 2 key strategic reserves for all South Vietnamese forces. Their commandant was Lieutenant General Le Nguyen Cang, while Brigadier General Bui Tay Lan acted as the field commander. The division kicked off the campaign with roughly 15,000 men. By late August, total casualties from the entire spring and summer stretch hit 1,358 killed, with another 5,500 wounded. These Marines ran into the exact same nightmare as the airborne. Progress was literally measured in yards. Each yard cost lives. Observers soon started calling the bloodbath Hamburger City. Up above, a totally different kind of war raged. Late on the night of July 12th at 10:50 p.m., National Intelligence warned of a B-52 flight coming in from the north. From a firing position at Ba Tung in Cam Lo District, Battalion 62 of the 236th Missile Regiment locked onto the incoming planes. Their commander was Captain Nguyen Quang Hung, born in 1944 in La Phu Commune, Huai Duc District, part of modern-day Hanoi. He joined up in 1963, mastering Soviet surface-to-air missile systems. He even helped pioneer tactical workarounds to beat American electronic jamming, a specific tactic the Vietnamese called the three-point method. Captain Hung demanded his battalion take the shot. They prepped 3 of their best missiles. Firing range was locked in at 38 kilometers. Beneath a perfectly clear moonlit sky, the rockets tore upward. Detonations rang out at 29, 28, and 27 kilometers.
Not a single bomb hit Quang Tri that night. By the very next morning, the BBC confirmed the shootdown on air. This marked the first confirmed kill of a B-52 by Vietnamese air defenses in the Quang Tri sector. That was 5 whole months before those famous B-52 losses over Hanoi during the massive December bombing raids. Battalion 62 would rip 2 more B-52s from the sky during those 81 days, one on September 6th, another on September 15th. That September 15th hit comes with a story that is basically Vietnamese military legend now.
One of the rockets they loaded had a huge hole punched straight through its first stage fin. Instead of scrapping it, the technical crew got creative. They hammered the jagged metal flat. Then they scooped up the fine, soft dirt left by earthworms around the rubber trees and packed it right into the gap. Finally, they took a strip of canvas, soaked it in mud, and pasted it over both sides of the patch. Colonel Hung later swore that patched-up missile flew dead straight. The B-52 went down. The very next morning was September 16th. But the story of those brutal 81 days isn't just about commanders and aircraft. Right behind the North Vietnamese holding the walls sat the Thach Han River. It runs 155 kilometers long, roughly 200 meters wide near Quang Tri, and maybe 2 meters deep at the crossing points. This was the one and only supply lifeline into the Citadel. Every single night, a fresh company crossed the water to back up the defense. Veterans remember those crossings with chilling clarity. A whole company would go in at dark. By sunrise, almost nobody was left breathing. Wading into that river were some of the 10,000 university students and young lecturers mobilized from Hanoi back in the spring. Most were just teenagers. A few even packed textbooks right next to their ammunition. And before the river took them, or the Citadel walls crushed them, some managed to write letters home.
Le Ba Duong, a Vietnamese soldier and poet who fought there and survived, later wrote about that exact stretch of water. He asked the ferryman to row gently because his fallen friends rested beneath the surface. Their short 20-year lives were now part of the current, soothing the shore for 1,000 years. Making it to the far bank was political commissar Phan Dinh Thong of Company 1, Battalion 18, part of the 127th Regiment. His men had marched almost 1,000 kilometers south from Dong Tru up in Quang Ninh Province. Late on the night of July 9th, around 10:30, 120 of his soldiers waded across the Thach Han. 3 days after that, on July 12th, the exact same day Battalion 62 scored its first B-52 kill, Company 1 walked into its first real firefight. On July 22nd, 20-year-old squad leader Nguyen Van Bao, originally from Ninh Binh Province, held his ground until a lead South Vietnamese tank rolled within 100 meters. He wrecked it with 2 rocket rounds. Then, on the night of July 24th, waves of B-52 strikes and jet runs hammered Company 1's position from 9 p.m. until 4 in the morning. 15 of Thong's soldiers died in the barrage. A massive 1-ton bomb slammed down right outside his personal bunker, but miraculously never went off. His company commander, Nguyen Hue Thai, was killed the very next day, and squad leader Bao died a week later.
By September, Company 1 had anchored its position for 50 of those 81 days. Decades later, when Thong sat down to tell the story, he broke down crying at the mere mention of Thai and Bao. He said he earned the right to be incredibly proud of the comrades who bled so much into the dirt of the Quang Tri Citadel. Meanwhile, somewhere else along the South Vietnamese line, a decisive tactical move was taking shape. On September 9th, forces faked an amphibious landing east of the city. Heavy naval guns, tactical air support, and B-52 bombers blasted empty beaches. Falling for it, North Vietnamese artillery shifted over to fight a ghost invasion. Using that massive distraction, the 6th Marine Battalion of the Vietnamese Marine Division, led by Lieutenant Colonel Do Hu Tung, pushed a recon patrol toward the Citadel's southeast corner. They hit surprisingly light resistance. By nightfall, they had a solid foothold on the outer wall. Come the morning of September 11th, the 3rd Marine Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Tran Xuan Quang forced a second violent breach up on the northern side. By the afternoon of September 15th, the last organized resistance inside those walls completely collapsed. The next 24 hours would decide what to name this battle and exactly how history would remember the fallout. The morning of September 16th, 1972, actually lives in two different histories.
In the first version, drawn from South Vietnamese and American records, the day belongs fully to the Marine Division of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Around midday, some claim noon, others say closer to 12:45 p.m., the flag of the Republic of Vietnam went up over the Citadel's west gate. 138 agonizing days of North Vietnamese occupation in Quang Tri City were over. The battle was finally won. The second version of history comes from Vietnamese official records. Veterans like Colonel Nguyen Quang Hung, who just hours earlier shot down his 3rd B-52, confirmed that the day actually belonged to the defenders of the Citadel. Around 5 o'clock in the pre-dawn darkness, the last North Vietnamese forces inside the walls executed a planned, orderly withdrawal north across the Thach Han River. Their strategic mission was already accomplished. They had inflicted enough casualties on the attackers and bought enough time at the Paris negotiating tables. Holding the position simply wasn't necessary anymore. They endured the battle, then left on their own terms. Both versions actually fit together. The North Vietnamese withdrew before dawn. South Vietnamese Marines pushed forward through the morning. By midday, the flag was up. The timeline works perfectly. The meaning attached to those events, however, is completely different, and that deep divide still shapes how the battle is remembered on both sides of a formerly split nation. But no matter which history you believe, the reality left on the ground was purely devastating.
Casualty figures remain sharply disputed. South Vietnamese Marine records show 977 killed and 3,658 total casualties during the counteroffensive. Total losses from March through August hit 1,358 dead and 5,500 wounded. The Airborne Division's 2nd Brigade was virtually wiped out. Roughly 20 American advisors and pilots died. South Vietnamese estimates put North Vietnamese deaths inside the Citadel at 8,135. Official Vietnamese sources claim over 4,000 of their own died across the 81 days, while estimating 26,000 South Vietnamese and American troops were killed. With higher and lower estimates across the board, the bitter disagreement remains completely unresolved half a century later. The physical destruction, however, was totally undeniable. Vietnamese sources report the Citadel and its surrounding area absorbed roughly 328,000 tons of combined bombs and artillery shells. Even if the exact tonnage is debated, the visual aftermath was absolute. According to every single observer, the city of Quang Tri basically ceased to exist. One American advisor compared the ruins to Berlin in 1945. Nearly 9 out of 10 buildings were completely destroyed. Beyond the walls, the province suffered even more. Down the highway of horror, crews recovered civilian remains well into autumn. Along the Thach Han River, former rice paddies became dumping grounds for unexploded ordnance fields that are still being cleared today. 3 months later, on January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The ceasefire began precisely at 8 in the morning the following day. The agreement simply reflected the brutal reality Quang Tri established. Over 100,000 North Vietnamese troops could stay inside South Vietnamese territory. The new ceasefire line ran along the Thach Han River, 13 miles below the old demilitarized zone. The Republic of Vietnam kept the Citadel and the province's southern half. The People's Army of Vietnam held the northern half and the Qua Viet port. The treaty recognized the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam as fully equal to Saigon. American forces had to withdraw. Saigon's support would now rely entirely on military aid, not combat troops. For President Nixon, this outcome felt like total vindication. His Vietnamization strategy held up, and South Vietnam survived. He won a landslide re-election in November 1972, right as South Vietnamese Marines were still digging in along the Tac Han. President Thieu saw things very differently. He had already rejected an earlier draft of the agreement in October 1972. That refusal triggered the intense 11-day American bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong, remembered in Vietnam as Dien Bien Phu in the skies. Ultimately, Thieu accepted the January terms because he was completely out of options. His country survived a massive conventional invasion, but only thanks to an emergency lifeline of American military gear. That lifeline actually had two names: Operation Enhance and Operation Enhance Plus.
Ordered by President Nixon in May 1972, these missions poured emergency supplies into South Vietnam on a scale unseen since peak American involvement. Operation Enhance dropped 69 helicopters, 55 jets, over 100 other aircraft, patrol boats, and 141 anti-tank missile launchers. Operation Enhance Plus arrived later that fall, bringing 234 more fighters, 277 helicopters, 72 tanks, and over 1,700 trucks. The price tag hit nearly $750 million. By the end of 1972, the Republic of Vietnam commanded one of the largest air forces and heavily equipped armies on the planet. President Thieu knew exactly what this meant. He later stated clearly that if American aid ever stopped, his government would collapse. Not in a year, or a month, or even a day. Within 3 hours, he said, he would have to abandon the presidential palace entirely. He was talking about the future. But that future was already laid bare by the territory the North was allowed to keep. The port of Qua Viet quietly became the launching pad for everything that followed. Under the ceasefire, the People's Army of Vietnam kept control of it. Within a single year, over 20% of all North Vietnamese supplies heading south flowed right through Qua Viet. A quiet coastal port before 1972 transformed into a massive logistical artery. The very infrastructure driving the final offensive on Saigon in 1975 was built on territory won at Quang Tri. On March 19, 1975, the That Han line fell. Quang Tri province was reoccupied in days. Just 6 weeks later, tanks of the People's Army of Vietnam crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. By then, President Thieu had already fled. The fallout hit hard in both nations. Brigadier General Vu Van Jai took the blame in Saigon for losing Quang Tri, losing his command in May 1972. A military court later handed him 5 years of hard labor for abandoning his post. Eventually, he emigrated to the United States, living quietly in Orange, California, until his death in October 2012. Lieutenant General No Quang Trong, however, walked away with his reputation completely intact. American observers who fought alongside him through the brutal summer counteroffensive spent decades praising him in memoirs, calling him one of the finest field commanders they ever witnessed. On the North Vietnamese side, Front Commander Lieutenant General Le Trong Tan steadily climbed the military ranks. He led major parts of the 1975 offensive that finally ended the war. He later served as Chief of the General Staff until he died in 1986 and was posthumously promoted to full general. Colonel Nguyen Quang Hung continued serving, later becoming Deputy Chief of Staff of the Vietnamese Air Defense and Air Force Service. He was officially named a Hero of the People's Armed Forces.
Today, the Quang Tri Citadel is a special national monument in Vietnam.
The battle-scarred walls from 1972 are carefully preserved exactly as the fighting left them. Inside the complex stands a memorial temple hosting solemn ceremonies every September 16th. Down on the banks of the Tap Chi River, visitors still light incense and float paper lotus flowers. It is a quiet tribute to the young men, many just university students from Hanoi, whose remains never left the dark current. In the United States and across the Vietnamese diaspora, surviving veterans of the Marine and Airborne divisions built memorial associations that still gather every single year. American advisors have added their own voices to history through extensive memoirs and interviews. Colonel John Ripley of the Dong Ha Bridge spoke openly about his time there until his death in 2008. And Marine advisor Colonel Gerald Turley wrote a defining account of the offensive that remains a foundational American source today. But in the end, every serious observer agrees on a few grim facts about Quang Tri. It was easily one of the most savage battles of the entire war. The staggering human cost crushed soldiers and civilians on all sides. A historic city standing since 1824 was completely leveled, taking decades to rebuild. And the young men and women who died during those 81 days, no matter which uniform they wore, simply did not deserve the brutal fate history handed them. This battle, more than any other engagement in 1972, forged the political settlement that came next, and through that fragile agreement, the war that followed it. When the smoke finally clears, all that remains is the earth. The citadel walls half restored, half left as an open scar, a quiet river passing by, rice paddies that still hide unexploded shells, and the memory of the men and women across all sides who bled their courage into those 81 days, the ones who never made it home. We leave you with this. Two nations remember the exact same events in completely opposite ways. The recapture versus the withdrawal. The absolute victory versus the strategic retreat. A flag raised at midday or a crossing made at dawn. Which truth do we owe the dead? Maybe the real answer is harder to stomach. In a clash like this, both memories are necessary, and neither one is enough on its own to hold the weight of what actually happened. Thanks for walking this grim ground with us on ARVN and United States Military. If this account left a mark on you, hit subscribe and drop a comment below. We have more of these stories coming soon.